Hello again, welcome back to IndyCar on the 4th of March. Now, without much good news happening actually to report on, I think it's worth returning to something which we often forget in the midst of all the political shenanigans which go on in the United Kingdom. Our attention's distracted by so many different things around us that it's hard to stay focused on what's actually really important to Scotland. We complain about the way the Labour Party is behaving, we complain about the Tory Party, we complain about the theft of our resources, we complain about the fact that our MPs elected to Westminster are not given a fair hearing, they're mocked and jeered, and so the list goes on. And it can end up sometimes appearing like we're just whining and we haven't got any power to do anything. However, the fact of the matter is that we have all the power that we need to free ourselves from the Union anytime we like. We've always had it, it's always been there, and it's a power which every people on the planet have, and I've spoken about it many times. It's called self-determination. Self-determination is the universal human right of all human beings, and it is guaranteed under the Charter of the United Nations that all people have the right to vote on their future, no matter what the situation is that they find themselves in politically. All peoples, all nations have this right. People often say that we can't have a referendum because the Supreme Court won't allow it. That's not true. The Supreme Court has just said that the Scottish Parliament can't hold the referendum because it is essentially a British Parliament. And that's true. But it's not true that we can't have a referendum. So I thought I would do a bit of research recently, and I looked for the most eminent international law specialist I could find in the United Kingdom, and a specific piece written by this academic, this legal expert, who incidentally is a professor at Cambridge University's law faculty. So we can never really say that anything coming from a source like this is somehow biased towards Scotland. It certainly isn't. But looking dispassionately at international law, this particular man wrote an entire article on why Scotland could have a referendum without the permission of Westminster, and it would be perfectly lawful and the result would stand. Now, the right to international self-determination, as I said, is guaranteed under international law. The International Court of Justice has, in recent years, in fact, approved many such self-determination votes. So, why don't we do it? Well, that's the question. Why don't we do it? People often worry that somehow the British state might do something to prevent us from having such a ballot. We might see riot police on the streets beating us and stealing ballot boxes that we saw in Spain. Would that happen? Well, I did a little bit of digging as well on the responsibilities of the police in Scotland and who they report to and what their powers are and how far they can act. Now, Police Scotland are, according to the devolution settlement, an entirely independent police force who are answerable only to the Scottish Parliament. However, there's always a however in these things, the Chief Constable is responsible to the senior man in the police, basically the Police Authority of Scotland, and incidentally the head of the Chief of Police in the United Kingdom is also their superior. But does that mean that the British state could use the Scottish police to prevent such a vote? No, it can't. It can't do that for a number of reasons, mainly the devolution settlement. However, the British state does have other police forces acting in Scotland which are nothing to do with the domestic police service at all. First of all, there's the Ministry of Defence Police, who are responsible for making sure that British military installations in Scotland are secure and preventing terrorist attacks on them, presumably. And then there's the Transport Police, who primarily, their job is to police the railway system in Scotland to make sure there is no crime and there are no attempts to interfere with the railways. So there are British police in Scotland, but they're not the police force. So I think that's not going to fly. There isn't some secret death squad or riot police who are going to come charging out and stop you from voting. That just is not going to happen. So what is it that gives us the power to do this? Well, there's several aspects to this, according to the article I read, one of which is, of course, international law under the jurisdiction of the International Court of Justice, and also the supreme authority being the United Nations itself, whose charter contains this guaranteed right. One of its fundamental pillars is that right to self-determination. So how does Scotland go about actually holding a referendum of its own? Does it need another Edinburgh Agreement, for example? Does it need a Section 30 order? And the answer to both those questions is no. It doesn't need either of those things. The Edinburgh Agreement was only necessary because Alex Salmond at the time interpreted the legal situation as he would need to request a temporary handover of powers from Westminster to the people of Scotland for the vote. It actually doesn't need to happen under international law, and this is where things are a bit different. Sarah Salyers and Salvo, whom you've heard me mentioning many times, are pursuing the legal aspects of Scotland's right to self-determination in the context of the United Nations. Now, I read an article by Peter Bell, who, although he acknowledges that Salvo was right to do this, to pursue this legal aspect of Scotland's right to self-determination, if we approached it simply from that angle and said we are going to establish our right to self-determination with the International Court of Justice, that would allow the British state the opportunity to fight on its own ground, to challenge it legally before it even started. Whereas, according to Peter, if we actually held the referendum and actually made it happen, then the British state would be forced to defend its own position that Scotland, A, isn't a colony, and B, is some kind of voluntary union, all of which we know are not true, which makes it much more difficult for the British state to fight back and to challenge the legality of Scotland taking this action. Now, there's another step that would need to be taken, and it is in relation to Europe, the European Union, and potentially the United Nations, and that is that these international bodies would need to be contacted by the elected politicians of Scotland. And I'm including here our MPs. They would need to be recalled to Edinburgh for a start, and they would need to assemble with other elected officials from Holyrood, our MSPs, in order to convene a sort of super parliament, if you like, a parliament which has nothing but the constitutional question to decide. And in that, it would then be possible to organise a ballot. Now, in order for the United Nations and organisations like the European Union to accept Scotland voting in this way, they would need to be assured that it was done transparently and fairly, and that there were invitations to both sides to participate equally, that they would have an equal opportunity to campaign, as they did in 2014. So there's not really a problem with this. We know how to do that. And that would be offered to both sides. So both those in favour of the Union and those in favour of independence would have equal opportunities to campaign and would have equal access to voting, and there would be no ambiguity whatsoever. It would be a binary question: should Scotland be an independent nation or not? Basically, it would be the same question. Now, so long as the United Nations and the European Union were satisfied that this referendum was going to be held in a fully democratic, using fully democratic means, then the benchmark for a successful outcome for the yes side would be 50% plus one vote. It would just be a simple majority. There is no hurdle to clear. We don't need 60% of people to say they want a referendum. We don't need any benchmarks at all. There are no conditions to be met. We just simply hold the referendum. Now, assuming that the referendum is held, how is it held? Because normally Scotland's local authorities would decide such things. It's possible, I guess, that some people in Scotland's local authorities might resist the idea of taking part in organising such a ballot, but they may be just a minority. It's entirely possible that the unions involved in the public services may be politicised by the No campaign and told not to cooperate, but that doesn't mean that the ballot cannot be organised by local authority staff who do want to see a democratic decision. And just because they are enabling and working to provide polling stations and ballot boxes and ballot papers does not mean that they definitely are voting yes. It just means they want to see a fair and free vote, and that is nothing that anybody should fear. Anybody working for a local authority should not fear that. It is their right as employees to do that if they're called upon to do so by the authority in Scotland, which at the time would be all of Scotland's elected officials acting as one single parliament. We're not talking about a government here, incidentally. We're talking about a huge parliament. All 57 of our MPs, including those who want to vote no, incidentally, who disagree with this, all of Scotland's elected MSPs, including those who don't support independence, would be a part of this, and they could vote against it. But if there is a majority in the super parliament for doing this, and I would expect there to be a sizable majority for that, then there's no reason why it can't happen. The question in my mind is, why will our politicians who do want independence not take this action? That is a very difficult question to answer, but I suspect that the main reasons for this are to do with elections and party politics. It would require both ALBA, the SNP and the Greens and ISP and maybe the Scottish Socialists and other smaller parties to all agree. And that would take a great effort of will. It would need to be organised on a national level so that all of those elected politicians come together in this super Scottish Parliament to decide this. And then do it. And do it in a way that everybody in Scotland understands and that everyone is free to vote whether they support the Union or whether they don't. This is what democracy is. According to the Cambridge professor, there is no reason whatsoever why another referendum can't be held 7 years, 8 years, 10 years, however many years after the first one. 8 years is only 2 UK governmental terms. That's all it is. So 2 changes of government, yes. Why can't you have another referendum? You could have a referendum every couple of years if you wanted to. But the point of this referendum is to decide the matter permanently. And there's no reason on earth why it cannot happen. All it takes is the political will to do it. The question really is there the political will to do it? Or are politicians so narrow-minded and self-obsessed with their own parties and their own careers that they will not do what the public actually wants them to do? We need to campaign, first of all, for this referendum to take place. This is a defiant referendum. This is challenging the United Kingdom on international legal terms to prevent us from having a lawful ballot. If the United Kingdom were stupid enough to try to ban such a referendum, they would reveal themselves to no longer be a Western democracy at all. That they could not do, legally or otherwise. Politically, the ramifications would be disastrous for the United Kingdom. It would show itself to be an authoritarian colonial power, preventing its own citizens from actually exercising their own right to self-determination under the United Nations Charter itself. So both while Salvo has work to do to contact these international bodies such as the UN, the European Union, the Council of Europe, and so on, the International Court of Justice, that homework needs to be done. The politicians themselves need to get together and link up with Salvo so that the entire operation is foolproof and legally binding and legally acceptable to everyone, including the European Union and the international courts and the United Nations. Now, if the referendum is held and it's successful for the yes side, we can't just walk away and declare independence straight away, because the rest of the United Nations members would view that askance. What they would expect a country to do, having won its right to independence, would be to negotiate in good faith with the the dominant, if you like, country in the Union, to dispose fairly of the nation's resources and its assets, and basically to exchange whatever value there is in what's left of the United Kingdom. In other words, Scotland's interests in the United Kingdom would need to be returned. Those assets which we hold as a part of the United Kingdom, which are Scottish, would need to be returned to us. Any assets which belong to England, and that would be very few, I suspect, because our oil fields, our gas fields, our offshore wind energy, our central industries, all of these things would remain ours. There may be some commercial interests in Scotland which belong to English firms, and their future would need to be secured. But having said all of that, once these good faith negotiations were over, then an independence declaration can be made, and all of Europe, the European Union would accept it, the Council of Europe would accept it, and the United Nations would accept it as well. So it can be done. It's been done many, many times by other countries. Over 65 countries, I think it is now, have now left the United Kingdom, have been decolonised. I've mentioned decolonisation before in this programme, but it's a last resort. As far as the United Nations is concerned, decolonisation is a long-term project. It can take decades, and that is not what I'm proposing here. What I'm proposing here is what Nicola Sturgeon promised us she would do, which was to hold the referendum if we were taken out of the European Union against our majority wishes. She would hold a referendum and challenge the United Kingdom, dare to defy it, dare to try and ban it under international law. Now, she didn't do that. She kicked it upstairs to the United Kingdom Supreme Court, probably knowing that it would be rejected, and then she resigned. And I think perhaps maybe things got too much for her, but we need somebody who's prepared to do that, and not just one somebody. The fact that all of our independence hopes were tied up in one politician was an extremely stupid idea. It's like painting a single target on one person. We need multiple leaders. We need a cohort of pro-independence leaders running this campaign and bringing these politicians back to Scotland to have the super parliament decide to hold the referendum and make sure the referendum is scrupulously fair and that it meets every requirement of international law. That way it cannot be challenged by the United Kingdom. And this is the only way to do it. And why nobody is talking about this is a mystery to me. Anyway, those are my thoughts today. Sometimes I like to have a good rant, but it's good to have a good rant based on some clinical legal facts coming from an unimpeachable source, Cambridge University, for goodness sake. This is not me making this stuff up. This has come directly from a source which you would expect actually to be more on the side of the Union. But this gentleman actually wrote the entire piece based on facts, dispassionately, in legal terms only, and he says we have the perfect right to do it. And I will take him at his word. Anyway, that's it from IndyCar today. I hope this was food for thought and something that you might like to lean on your own MP and MSP and say it's about time we started doing this. If Scotland is to become an independent country, the people expect the politicians to provide us with a vote so that we can decide it. Otherwise, all talk of independence is just rhetoric. That's it for the rant today from IndyCar. I'll see you all again later in the week. Thanks for watching. By the way, you can always rewind this if you came in halfway through and missed it, because live rewind is possible on Facebook at the moment. You can also message me directly. So there's all sorts of ways of contacting me. Please keep donating. It's helping the content. It's helping me to keep building my audience. And it's also helping the audience over on YouTube as well. We're hoping to upload to other channels eventually as well. Anyway, I'll see you soon. Keep the faith, and bye for now.